Hey everyone, are you working hard getting ready for those UPSC mains? I bet you are. Well, you've come to the right place. Today we're doing a deep dive into a topic that's almost guaranteed to be on your radar. We're talking about India-Mauritius relations.
It's a hot topic for sure.
It is, and guess what? It's been making headlines lately because PM Modi's getting ready for a visit to Mauritius.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just another one of those diplomatic visits. It's a really important relationship for India. If you want to understand the ins and outs, it's going to be crucial for both mains and prelims.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
It's a really fascinating mix of international relations and geopolitics. Plus, you even get a little bit of history thrown in there too.
All right, so let's paint a picture for our listeners. We're talking about Mauritius, right?
Right.
An island nation sitting there in the Indian Ocean. A lot of people don't realize that it has a population that's largely of Indian descent.
Yeah, you probably remember that from your diaspora studies, right?
I do, but it's not just some shared heritage, is it?
No, it's much deeper than that. The historical connection goes way back.
Because?
Both India and Mauritius were British colonies. Obviously, India got its independence back in 1947, and then Mauritius followed suit a little bit later in 1968.
But here's where it starts to get a little bit tricky, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Just a few years before Mauritius actually became independent, the UK did something pretty controversial.
They did.
They separated the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius, and they created this new thing called the British Indian Ocean Territory.
Yeah, and that's where all the controversy comes from, because the UK went ahead and established a joint military base with the U.S. on Diego Garcia.
Right.
And if you don't know, Diego Garcia is the largest island in that archipelago.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that led to the displacement of all the native Chagosian people who were living there. And ever since then, Mauritius has been fighting to get its sovereignty over all those islands back.
It's a dispute that has been going on for decades now. And it's been in the news a lot lately because something big just happened.
It has.
The UK and Mauritius finally reached an agreement.
I know, it's huge news.
It is. So tell us a bit about this agreement.
Okay, so the UK has agreed to cede sovereignty of the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. But, and this is a big but, the military base on Diego Garcia will remain operational.
So it's a win for Mauritius, but with kind of a catch.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So I'm curious, from like a strategic point of view, why is this base so important, especially for the U.S.?
Well, you know, the Indian Ocean is becoming more and more vital every day in terms of global trade and security. So that base that's on Diego Garcia, it gives the U.S. this strategic foothold in the region.
Right.
It lets them project power, monitor maritime activity, and, you know, basically keep an eye on everything that's happening in a region that's becoming more and more contested.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So where does India stand in all of this?
Well, India has consistently backed Mauritius's claim to the Chagos Archipelago. And, you know, this stance really aligns with India's own history with colonialism and its overall commitment to decolonization.
I see. But isn't there also a strategic element to India's support?
Oh, absolutely. You know, India sees the Indian Ocean as its backyard, and if it wants to protect its own security and economic interests, it has to maintain stability in the region. That's paramount for them.
That makes sense. And speaking of India's interests, PM Modi is going to be the chief guest at Mauritius's National Day celebrations, isn't he?
He is.
So besides the whole obvious diplomatic angle, what's the significance of this particular visit?
It's a really powerful symbol of India's commitment to Mauritius. You know, this goes beyond just a friendly handshake or a photo op. This is about reaffirming that close partnership between those two nations. It's about showcasing their collaborative efforts on the world stage, especially now when the geopolitical landscape is changing so much.
So it sounds like India and Mauritius have a pretty multifaceted relationship.
Yeah, it's a lot more than just symbolism.
So tell me a little bit more about that.
It's really all about collaboration, and their collaboration spans lots of different areas, from security to economic partnerships and even development assistance.
Okay, let's unpack all that. You mentioned security cooperation. What does that look like on the ground?
Well, for starters, the Indian Air Force and Navy are going to be actively participating in Mauritius's National Day celebrations.
Oh, wow.
So that's going to be a really visible display of military collaboration. And it's a pretty clear sign of the close defense ties between the two nations.
Interesting. What about on the economic front?
Oh, India and Mauritius have a really unique partnership there.
Do they?
They do. In fact, that was actually the first ever trade agreement India signed with an African nation.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yep. It's called the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation and Partnership Agreement, or CECPA.
CECPA. All right, now this is where it gets really interesting,
It does.
especially for our UPSC aspirants listening.
Right.
I've heard a lot of whispers about something called the Mauritius route. What is that all about?
Ah, yes, the Mauritius route. It's one of those terms that any serious UPSC candidate should know like the back of their hand.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It all comes down to something called the Double Taxation Avoidance Convention, or DTAC, between India and Mauritius.
Okay.
And for a very long time, this agreement made Mauritius a major hub for foreign investments into India.
Hold on, hold on. How does that even work? Like, why would companies choose to route their investments through Mauritius?
It's all about those sweet, sweet tax benefits. The DTAC, what it did was it allowed companies to take advantage of lower tax rates in Mauritius when they were investing in India. So basically, it made investing in India through Mauritius a lot more attractive from a financial perspective.
So I guess it was a win-win situation, right?
Initially, yeah, you could say that. Mauritius was benefiting and India was attracting more foreign investment. But over time, people started raising concerns about tax avoidance and treaty shopping. And that led to some revisions in the DTAC to try and make it a little bit more balanced.
So they had to find that sweet spot.
Exactly, exactly. And, if you want to grasp the complexities of India's economic policies and how they intersect with international financial flows, you have to understand all the nuances of this Mauritius route. And that kind of in-depth analysis, that's exactly what those UPSC examiners are looking for.
So I think we've covered quite a lot already. We've talked about the historical ties, the breaking news about that agreement about the Chagos Archipelago, the strategic implications of the U.S. base, and even dug into the intricacies of the Mauritius route.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's still so much more to uncover here, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. We've barely scratched the surface. It's fascinating, isn't it? How this seemingly isolated issue with the Chagos Archipelago is actually a microcosm of all the bigger power dynamics that are playing out in the Indian Ocean.
It really is. It's like we've got the U.S. base, India's influence keeps growing, and then there's the elephant in the room,
Great.
China. So how does China fit into all of this?
Well, China's rise as a global power has really added a whole new dimension to the Indian Ocean region. They've been strategically investing in ports and building infrastructure in countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And that's definitely raised some concerns for both India and the U.S.
So it's like a three-way power play.
Yeah, basically.
Everyone's vying for control and influence, right?
It's definitely a lot more nuanced than that. But yeah, essentially that's what it is. India wants to remain the dominant regional power. The U.S. wants to counter China's growing influence. And China wants to expand its footprint in the region.
And right in the middle of all of this is the Chagos Archipelago with that very strategically important U.S. base.
It really is. It's like a geopolitical pressure cooker.
It is. So this creates a very delicate balancing act for Mauritius, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. They're going to want to assert their newly regained sovereignty over the Chagos Islands, but at the same time, they're going to have to maintain those good relations with both India and the U.S.
It's a tough spot to be in. And we can't forget about the people who are actually living there, the Chagosan people.
Right.
They were forcibly removed from their homes. What happens to them now? Does this new agreement pave the way for their return?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But unfortunately, the agreement doesn't really address the issue of resettlement at all. So it's probably going to be a big point of contention and negotiation over the coming months and years. And, it really reminds us that all this geopolitical maneuvering, it often has very real human consequences.
It's heartbreaking to think about what they've had to endure, what they've gone through. Their voices really need to be heard in all of this.
Yeah, they do. And for all of you out there who are preparing for the UPSC mains exam, this is a perfect opportunity to really showcase your analytical skills.
How so?
Think about it. How does this whole Chagos Archipelago issue intersect with international law, with human rights, with all the complexities of decolonization? These are all themes that could very easily come up in your exams.
You're right. It's a perfect example of how something that seems like an isolated event can actually have ripple effects across the entire globe.
Yeah.
And it touches on so many different things, from security to economics to human rights.
Exactly. And to truly grasp all of these issues, you can't just read the headlines. You have to really understand the historical context. You have to look at the motivations of all the key players, and you have to think about the potential long-term consequences.
And that's what we try to do here, isn't it?
It is.
We don't want you to just memorize facts and figures. We want to give you the tools to understand that really intricate web of global events and how everything is connected.
Right. And remember, the UPSC examiners, they're not looking for people who can just memorize a bunch of facts. They want to see critical thinking. They want to see analysis, and they want to see that you can connect the dots. And that's what's going to set you apart from everyone else.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's shift our focus back to India-Mauritius relations for a minute. We talked about security cooperation, we talked about the CECPA agreement, but there's also another layer to their partnership, right?
Right.
It's the development assistance, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. India's been providing development assistance to Mauritius for a long time now. It's not just about these big trade deals or military exercises. It's also about just being there as a reliable partner when they're in need.
Can you give some concrete examples of that?
Of course. You remember the Wakashio oil spill back in 2020?
Mhm.
Well, India was one of the very first countries to respond. They sent ships, they sent experts to help with the cleanup and environmental mitigation efforts.
Yeah, I remember that. It was a huge ecological disaster.
It was, and India's response really underscored just how deep that commitment to Mauritius runs.
Yeah.
And then more recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, India was there again, providing Mauritius with all those essential medical supplies and vaccines they needed.
So it's about building that trust and goodwill
Yeah.
through consistent support, especially in times of crisis.
Exactly. And this kind of soft power diplomacy, it can be just as important as that hard power, that military might, or that economic clout. It's all part of India's strategy to strengthen all of its relationships in the Indian Ocean region.
It sounds like there's really a lot more to this relationship than we see on the surface.
There is.
It's not just about that shared history or those cultural ties. It runs a lot deeper.
It does.
Strategic partnerships, it's economic collaboration,
Yep.
and it's genuine support, particularly when things get rough.
You got it. And for all our UPSC folks out there listening, this multifaceted nature of India-Mauritius relations gives you a lot of great material that you can analyze. Think about all the different dimensions of their partnership: defense, trade, development, and even cultural exchanges. These are all potential areas that you could explore on your mains exam.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, let's shift gears a little bit and move on to some final thoughts. And we'll leave you with a question to ponder, something to think about as you continue your UPSC preparations. Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this deep dive. We started with the Chagos Archipelago dispute and all that historical baggage that comes with it, and then moved into how major players like the US, China, and obviously India are all maneuvering around each other. We even took a close look at the economic intricacies of that Mauritius route and how that's all been evolving over time.
It really shows you how events that seem isolated can have these huge consequences that reach all over the globe. It also demonstrates how interconnected our world really is. And this is the kind of big picture thinking that's going to be so essential for those of you tackling the UPSC exams.
You're so right. So for all of our dedicated UPSC aspirants out there listening, what are the key takeaways from all of this? What should you be focusing on as you prepare for mains and prelims?
Well, I'd say the most important thing to remember is that this whole situation is a prime example of how history, geopolitics, international law, and economics all work together. Those are all core themes for the UPSC, so you really need to understand how those things are connected.
I see what you mean. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about understanding the why behind the what.
Exactly. So you need to think about the motivations of the key players. Why is the Chagos Archipelago so strategically important? What are India's goals for the Indian Ocean region? And how does China's influence play into all of this?
And how does all of that affect the relationship between India and Mauritius?
Oh, that's a great question. Mauritius is in a really tricky position. They've gotten sovereignty back over the Chagos Islands, but that U.S. base is still there. So they need to balance their relationship with India, a key ally in the region, while also figuring out how to deal with the U.S. and keep in mind China's ambitions, which are always looming in the background.
It's like a real-world example of diplomacy and strategic decision-making, which I'm sure the UPSC examiners will love to throw your way.
You know it. And we also can't forget about the human side of all of this. What happened to the Chagosian people brings up all sorts of important questions about human rights, decolonization, and whether nations have a responsibility to make up for historical injustices.
It just goes to show that geopolitics isn't all about maps and who has the most power. It's about real people and the impact these events have on their lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you really want to understand all the complexities, you need to dig a little deeper than just the headlines. And for today's deep dive, we use some great articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. Both are excellent sources if you want to stay informed on current affairs.
That's a great point. Those are must-reads for any serious UPSC aspirant. And while we're at it, if you found today's deep dive helpful, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more UPSC-focused content. It really does help us reach more aspirants just like you.
And if you have any questions, or if you want to talk more about what we discussed, leave us a comment below. We're always happy to chat with our listeners and help you get ready to ace those exams.
That's right. So until next time, keep studying hard and best of luck on your UPSC journey.